Project is, I think it's evolving. It's as large as it needs to be. Obviously, I think that what needs to happen, and Lisa Marie's kind of been articulating this, and as we've talked about it, is, what's the real kind of research agenda here? What are research questions? What is the paradigm? What are the things that we want to find out as we approach the site? And there are many questions that can be asked, and all of those require different kinds of methodologies. Obviously we have a documents piece and an oral history piece here that can stand alone, and I think in part it should stand alone, but it also will provide an important foundation to support an important historic context to support the archaeology. So I think as we've been kind of discussing, and Lisa Marie has been working with Rosie on, I think it's really just kind of establishing what's our in, because if you want to investigate something, you just don't go in blind. You have a research question, a particular kind of agenda, a set of questions that you want to answer. I think the development and evolution of life here at this kind of farmstead, how typical is it, how not typical is it, how does it respond to the historical context, the changing landscape in which these people found themselves as they went through time. It was obviously a pretty prosperous farm at one point. This is not a typical little hole-in-the-wall Pennsylvania farmstead. There's a lot of pieces of, well, where did the money come from, and when was it established, and obviously it was very successful because then they added on and did things. So I think there's a story to be told here about the evolution of this particular site within the broader context of Western Pennsylvania farming, and also, and there's the individual kind of Jackson piece. So, how does a guy who grows up here, were they well off? Was this how do we explain from the story of this site how this man came to be who he was? And I think that's an important piece too. And that, from your perspective, that I think you're interested in his life and what he wanted to do, but we have to explain, how did this guy from really quite rural Pennsylvania here end up being where he came from? Well, let's look at then the history of this property. Let's look at his family. Let's look at the land. Let's look at the development of this as a farmstead. So, obviously fairly wealthy and prosperous. So did they have access to private education? Were there books going on? I mean, Lisa Marie could probably speak to this a lot more. But so I think from an archaeological perspective, there are lots of questions that don't necessarily dovetail with some of your questions, but I think they can, if we examine this as the evolution of this site within the context, and then say, well, how does a person like Jackson come from a place like this? How do we explain his existence? So I think that's a nice way in which perhaps those two inquiries can kind of marry. And Ben, perhaps you can speak to some of that as well.
We're still getting our handle on again what Rosie's going to do here, but Mary Ann's comments are very spot on. That this individual goes on to do some pretty remarkable things and comes from, again, a very out-of-the-way place. And I don't know what we're thinking with Rosie or what Rosie's thinking. We've kind of been waiting for Rosie to get into her internship and get a sense of what you all have at the center, which I haven't seen yet, and we'll see, I suppose, this afternoon, and how the history piece might build upon or really maybe back up and support the archaeology piece. Who is this guy? Where does he come from? And tell a broader story. Also, I think you were talking about the oral histories earlier. I think that might be a priority because as the years go by, right, you're probably losing access to that resource, which I know you all have done a bit of already. Is that correct? Right. So that might be a priority that we should talk about because that's evidence that once it's gone, right, we don't have it anymore. So oral history piece should be a priority.
To reiterate what Ben said, it's pretty extensive. It is fairly rare to find this much foundation that still exists, so I'm excited to kind of visualize what the barn looked like, just from the limited knowledge I have about Pennsylvania barns. I think this is we'll have to go check the midden and kind of see where the things are, so spatially and architecturally I think we can get a lot of information out just from the foundations. I think we can learn a lot, and it's pretty interesting because you can see the change in technology. They were putting things in their basement, kind of throwing it away as they were updating their technology. So that's always neat. In farmhouses, you can really see industrialization and mechanization and standardized production of items really ramp up, and then you can sometimes look at, do these farm families decide to participate in that, or are they kind of still staying outside of consumer behavior and making their own things and canning their own food? So That's always a good research question to kind of answer. That one takes a while. That one takes a lot of excavation. But.
What's your expectation of Rose here?
Well, first of all, she's an undergrad, so we have to maintain the fact that she's going to do an undergrad level project and not a graduate level project. And she's also doing a second project with public history, so we just need to be cognizant that this is not her only class. So I think we really need to figure out the agreement with, if we are collecting any artifacts, what will happen to that? So you have to start from backwards. As soon as you take artifacts off from a site, you are responsible for that forever. So we need a plan. I am a member of Society for Historical Archaeology, and so I've signed on with different methods and ethics of how to excavate a site such as this, which farmstead sites are different from every other site. So there's different techniques. Rosie's been reading about the different theories and approaches, and how to even think about a site this large. It's very different than if you were doing like an alleyway downtown, much tighter space. And how things are spread out, and are we including things like fence lines? You said there's a lot of pipes going on here, so we probably need to map all that. So I think with Rosie, we got to figure out maybe mapping and getting a really beautiful, clear, digital, tied into the global system.
Can I get credit for this?
We'll send you the tuition bill.
Yeah, exactly. What does midden mean?
Back when people were living here, there was no garbage pickup. There was no municipal or county garbage dumps. So people had to find a place for their trash in their own yard. Culturally, people wanted to keep their front yard very fancy and nice and pretty looking. People would fill in low-lying areas by throwing their trash down a hill, which I think it sounds like is what's happening here. So as soon as I see hillsides, Ben picked up on this too. He's like, "Oh, where's the midden?"